The power does not go out with a bang. It goes out with a click. 1 second the refrigerator is humming in the background, so constant you forgot it was even there, and the next second it is not. Silence. Then the small sounds start disappearing one by one. The air conditioning, the Wi-Fi router blinking off, the clock on the stove going dark. That is the moment. Not the wind outside, not the emergency alert on your phone, not even the storm itself. The click, and 3 days later, that same silence is still there, except now you are standing in front of your pantry, the one that looked full a week ago, wondering if it can actually feed the people in this house. Sit with this number for a second. FEMA's National Preparedness Report found that only 51% of American adults believe they are ready for a disaster. Not are ready. Believe they are. Read that gap again, because it is the entire reason this video exists. Half the country is confident. Confidence is not food. Confidence does not run a stove that has no power, does not open a can, does not stop a child from crying, because dinner tonight looks nothing like dinner usually looks. So before anything else, one honest question. Would you have made that 51%? Or would 3 days in the dark have told you the truth first? The Atlantic hurricane season runs from the 1st of June through the 30th of November, with its climatological peak stretching from mid-August into mid-October, according to the National Hurricane Center. Every year, forecasters release seasonal outlooks, some predicting an active season, some predicting a quiet one. But here is what almost never makes it into the headlines. Meteorologists at the Colorado State University Tropical Program and at NOAA both repeat the same warning, season after season, regardless of the numbers they publish. It only takes one storm making landfall in your area to turn a quiet season into the worst year of your life. A below-average forecast does not mean a below-average risk for the specific city you live in. That distinction matters more than any storm count. So the real question was never how many hurricanes are coming. The real question is what happens in your kitchen on day one without power, and whether what is sitting in your cabinets right now could actually carry your family through it. There is a second layer to this that rarely gets discussed, and it has nothing to do with storms and everything to do with timing. The households that scramble to shop once a storm is already named and tracking toward the coast are shopping under the worst possible conditions, crowded aisles, picked over shelves, and a level of stress that makes people grab whatever is left rather than what actually makes sense for their family. The families who quietly build a pantry in the calm weeks of early summer, long before any system is spinning in the Atlantic, are making the same decisions with a completely different mindset. Slower, more deliberate, and usually cheaper, since emergency shopping under pressure tends to cost more per item than the same list bought gradually over a normal grocery trip. The federal minimum, the baseline that Ready.gov publishes, is a 3-day supply of water and non-perishable food, with 1 gallon of water per person per day. That number is not a suggestion pulled from thin air. It is calculated around basic hydration, food preparation, and sanitation needs for a household, with no access to power or running water. And yet when you actually map that number against what a family eats in 72 hours, most pantries fall apart by the second day, not because people did not shop, but because they shopped for the wrong things. Let's walk through what actually holds up, and just as important, why. Start with protein that does not need refrigeration. Canned tuna, canned chicken, and canned beans sit at the center of almost every emergency food list published by nutrition researchers, and there is a reason beyond convenience. Protein slows the crash that comes from an all-carbohydrate diet, the kind of afternoon fog that makes decision-making harder exactly when a family needs to be making good decisions. A can of protein, sitting quietly on a shelf, is doing more for a stressed household than its size suggests. Shelf-stable milk, the kind sold in cartons that do not require refrigeration until opened, solves a problem most people do not think about until it is too late. Children do not adjust well to sudden changes in diet during a crisis, and a familiar glass of milk with a meal does something for a household's sense of normal that canned vegetables alone cannot. A jar of nut butter belongs on this list for a reason that has nothing to do with taste. It is dense in calories relative to its weight. It requires no preparation, no heat, and no water, and it can be eaten directly from a spoon by an exhausted adult, or spread on a cracker for a child who refuses anything unfamiliar. In a scenario where cooking is not possible, calorie density without preparation time becomes its own kind of currency. Canned fruit, packed in its own juice rather than heavy syrup, offers something that dry goods cannot: a small amount of moisture and natural sugar that can lift a mood in a way that is easy to underestimate, until you have gone 2 days eating only crackers and canned beans. Mood under stress is not a side note. Researchers who study nutrition in military and disaster settings consistently associate monotonous, low-variety diets with faster morale decline, even when caloric intake stays technically adequate. Whole grain crackers, the plain kind, not the ones packed with airy filler, give a household something solid to build meals around without needing a stove. Pair them with the protein and the nut butter already on this list, and a single box quietly becomes the backbone of several meals. A can of hearty soup, the chunky kind meant to be eaten on its own rather than diluted, does something none of the previous items can do by themselves. It delivers warmth. Even without a working stove, soup can be heated over a small camp burner or a single propane ring in a way that turns an otherwise flat, cold meal into something that feels like an actual dinner. There is a reason field nutrition research keeps circling back to the idea that warm food, even something simple, changes how a stressed household experiences a hard day. It is not about the ingredients so much as the signal a warm bowl sends that things are still, in some small way, under control. It is also worth pausing on something that has nothing to do with food itself: a manual can opener. It sounds almost too obvious to mention, and that is exactly why so many households skip it. Every item on this list so far assumes the ability to open a can, and an electric opener is useless the moment the power goes out. A small manual opener, tucked into the same drawer or bin as the emergency food, costs next to nothing and prevents the strange, entirely avoidable situation of owning several days of protein and having no way to reach it. Now, here is a comment worth leaving below. If your family had to eat only what is currently in your kitchen for 3 full days, no store runs, no deliveries, what is the first thing you think would run out? Type it in the comments, because most people are surprised by their own answer. And if this kind of information is useful to you, subscribing helps this channel keep digging into the things that quietly matter more than they get credit for. Honey deserves a place on almost every serious list, not because it is exciting, but because of something closer to a curiosity. Properly sealed honey does not spoil, full stop, a fact that has been confirmed by archaeologists who have found edible honey in ancient sealed containers thousands of years old. Beyond the novelty, it is a fast source of usable energy, and for households managing a scratchy throat or a restless child, it carries a small comfort that goes beyond nutrition. An electrolyte drink mix, the powdered kind that dissolves into water, solves a problem that is easy to overlook when the lights are on. Without air conditioning, without refrigerated drinks, and often without reliable clean water pressure, dehydration risk climbs quietly during a power outage, especially for children and older adults. A small canister of electrolyte powder weighs almost nothing and can matter more than most of what sits in a typical pantry. Rice that cooks quickly, rather than the kind that needs prolonged boiling, becomes valuable the moment fuel for cooking is limited. A camp stove or a single burner running on a small propane canister can only do so much work before that fuel runs out, and a grain that finishes in a few minutes instead of 20 makes every ounce of fuel go further. Canned vegetables round out what rice and protein cannot provide on their own, and choosing varieties like corn, carrots, or green beans, ones that hold their texture reasonably well, keeps meals from feeling like an exercise in survival rather than something resembling dinner. Here is the item that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Dried seaweed snacks, the thin, lightly salted kind sold in most grocery stores, are quietly one of the smartest additions to an emergency shelf, and almost nobody thinks to buy them for this purpose. They weigh nothing, they do not spoil for a long stretch of time, and they carry a concentration of minerals, including iodine and sodium, that becomes genuinely useful when a household is sweating through a hot, humid, power-free stretch of days and losing more salt and minerals than usual. It is not the item you picture when you imagine a hurricane pantry. That is exactly why it belongs on this list. Most people, when asked to picture emergency food, picture beige: crackers, rice, canned beans, dry cereal, a wall of practical but visually forgettable calories. That mental image is part of why so many households understock, because a pantry that looks unappealing on a normal Tuesday gets pushed to the bottom of the shopping list every single time a family walks past it. An item that breaks that pattern, something with actual flavor and a bit of crunch, tends to survive longer on a real shelf because people are more willing to buy it in the first place and more willing to rotate it through regular meals instead of letting it sit forgotten until the expiration date has already passed. Instant coffee or tea does something that has nothing to do with calories and everything to do with keeping a household functioning like itself. For an adult used to a morning routine, losing that small ritual on top of losing power, sleep, and normalcy compounds stress in a way that is easy to dismiss until you have lived through it. A jar of instant coffee costs almost nothing and preserves a piece of a person's ordinary life inside an extraordinary few days. Dried fruit, the kind without added sugar coating if you can find it, gives a household a shelf-stable source of fiber and natural sweetness that plain canned goods cannot replicate. It also travels well if an evacuation becomes necessary partway through a storm, which a 3-day supply always has to account for, since not every hurricane scenario ends with a family sheltering in place. Some end with a car packed in under an hour, and the food that matters most in that version of the story is whatever can survive a glove compartment and be eaten one-handed. Granola bars or oat-based bars earn their spot for one simple reason: they require zero preparation, which matters enormously on the first chaotic hours after a storm passes, when nobody has the bandwidth to think about assembling a meal. A bar that a child can open themselves is worth more in that moment than a far more nutritious meal that requires 10 minutes nobody has. Powdered eggs are the item most people have never purchased in their life and probably never considered. They store for an extraordinarily long time compared to almost anything else on a supermarket shelf. They rehydrate with water, and they can be cooked on a single burner to produce something that tastes and feels like an actual meal, rather than another cold, straight-from-the-can dinner. After several days of crackers and canned protein, a hot plate of scrambled eggs does something for a family's sense of normal that is hard to measure but easy to notice. And finally, a small stash of something purely for comfort, a bar of dark chocolate that does not require refrigeration to stay edible, or a bag of hard candy that lasts indefinitely. This is not about nutrition. It is about morale, and researchers who study disaster psychology note, again in associative rather than absolute terms, that small, familiar pleasures during a crisis appear linked to better emotional regulation, particularly in children who cannot fully process what is happening around them. There is one more habit worth mentioning, and it has nothing to do with what goes into the pantry and everything to do with what happens to it afterward. An emergency supply that gets built once and forgotten for 2 or 3 years is not nearly as reliable as it feels sitting on the shelf. Canned goods and shelf-stable items are not eternal. They simply last far longer than fresh food, and a simple rotation habit, eating the oldest cans during ordinary weeks and replacing them with fresh ones, keeps the entire supply both fresh and genuinely dependable when it matters. Households that treat their emergency shelf as a living part of the kitchen, rather than a sealed box in the garage, tend to actually know what they have when a storm is approaching, instead of discovering expired cans and stale crackers in the exact moment they cannot afford that discovery. None of this works without water, and this is the part people underestimate most. The federal guidance of 1 gallon per person per day is calculated for drinking and basic sanitation combined. which means the number that sounds generous on paper often runs tight in practice, especially in summer heat with no air conditioning. Storing more than the stated minimum, if your space allows it, is a reasonable adjustment many households make once they actually run the math for their own family size. There is also a detail almost nobody thinks about until the power has already been out for hours: the danger zone. Bacteria in food multiply rapidly at temperatures between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, according to food safety guidance from the United States Department of Agriculture, which is precisely the range a refrigerator drifts into within a few hours of losing power. This is why the items on this list matter so much. None of them depend on a refrigerator functioning correctly to remain safe to eat, which removes an entire category of risk that most people never think about until they are standing in front of a warm refrigerator, wondering what is still safe. A closed refrigerator, left undisturbed, generally keeps food cold enough for roughly 4 hours after power is lost, and a full freezer can hold safe temperatures for closer to 2 full days if the door stays shut, according to guidance published by food safety researchers. That window sounds reassuring until you remember that most hurricane-related outages last well beyond 2 days, sometimes stretching into a full week or more depending on how widespread the damage is. This is precisely why a pantry built around shelf-stable food is not a backup plan. It is the actual plan, with the refrigerator treated as a temporary bonus rather than something to depend on. What ties all of this together is not any single item, it is the pattern underneath them. A pantry that survives a hurricane is not the one with the most cans. It is the one built around what a stressed, tired, possibly frightened household can actually prepare, eat, and tolerate for several days straight, without power, without much water pressure, and without the emotional bandwidth to cook anything complicated. Calories matter. So does morale. So does a child accepting a meal without a fight on the second night. Preparedness, the real kind, accounts for all three. One last thing before you go check your own shelves. Everything discussed here is general information based on published guidance from federal agencies and food safety researchers, not a personal recommendation for your specific household. Families managing medical conditions, food allergies, infant nutrition, or mobility limitations should shape their own emergency supply around a conversation with a doctor or a registered dietitian, because a list like this one is a starting point, not a substitute for care that actually knows your situation. That is not a disclaimer tacked onto the end for legal comfort. It is the same thing a careful friend would tell you before letting you walk away with a shopping list like this one. So go look, not at what you think is in your pantry, but at what is actually there. Count the days it would really carry your family, not the days you assume it would. Open the cabinet and be honest about it, the way you would if a friend asked you to walk them through exactly what you would eat if the power went out tonight and stayed out for the rest of the week. Because the families who come through a hurricane calmly are rarely the ones who bought the most. They are the ones who checked before the forecast gave them a reason to, who treated a quiet, ordinary week in June the same way they would treat the week a storm was named and tracking toward their coastline. Preparedness, in the end, is not a single dramatic trip to the store. It is a pantry that already reflects the answer, sitting there quietly, long before anyone asks the question.